So there are different types of synovial joints, and there's actually 6 that you need to know. The first we've already been talking about, between the carpal bones, they have gliding motion, and this is a type that is referred to as a plane joint. So gliding motion, I'll show you images of these. All of these joints, interestingly, can be seen, all of them, there's one of, or many of each, in, well, not many, but all of them are in your upper arm. We also have the hinge joint. So if you think about a hinge joint, like a door, your elbow is an example of a hinge joint. We have a pivot joint. The radius and the ulna pivot around each other. So the radio-ulnar joints are actually pivot joints. We also could talk about the pivot joint in the neck with the dens coming up. That would be another example of a pivot joint. We have condylar joints. So that's where we have a condylar process that is like a round process. So like the head, that's ball and socket, but like in the jaw, you have the condylar process of the mandible sitting in a shallow depression called a fossa, the mandibular fossa on the temporal bone. So the jaw would be an example of the condylar joint. And then we have the saddle joints. And when we look at that there are saddle joints in your hand. And then we specifically, the saddle joint is in the thumb. And we have the ball and socket. So let's look at each of these in your upper limb. Plane joints, flat surfaces. These are non-axial. So they don't actually rotate around an axis. They're just little sliding motions. Those actually are diarthrotic. So even though there's not a lot of movement, there's enough movement to classify them as being diarthrotic rather than amphiarthrotic. Amphiarthrotic is more like the cartilaginous joints. Okay. We also see the hinge joint. And so you'll remember that this is of the ulna bone, the U, that is the trochlear notch, and it articulates with the trochlea, and it creates that hinge mechanism. So this is also diarthrotic. There's lots of movement in your elbow joint. When we look at the elbow joint, it is said to be uniaxial. So here, this is showing purple. So it's just moving around one axis in one plane. We're just moving in one plane. So there's not a lot of mobility at the elbow. We do have rotational ability at the radio-ulnar joints. If we look at the pivot joint, so remember that this would be the ulna. This is the head of the radius, and it's sitting in the ulnar notch on, excuse me, the radial notch on the ulna. And there is some connective tissue, fibrous connective tissue that is sitting and it's wrapped around that head. And that head can rotate. And so that is, that rotation of that head is the movement of the pivot joints. Pivot joints move, and they're really only rotating around one axis. So that is also uniaxillary. So it's only one range of motion. When we look at the condylar joints, in this example, it is the metacarpo, so that's the metacarpals, and where the phalanges articulate with the metacarpals. Notice that this is like a condylar, a round-shaped process sitting into a little indentation, a fossa. And if we look at this, this is biaxial. So we can move it like this. We can also move them apart, right? So two different planes of motion, biaxial. Those are also would be diarthrotic. All these are diarthrotic. The thumb joint, super important to primates. We have opposable thumbs, and in fact, this is a special movement. It's called opposition, where the thumb opposes the fingers. So opposition is only seen in that thumb joint. When we look at that carpometacarpal, there is what is referred to as a saddle joint. And so you can see why it is called a saddle joint. It looks like a saddle and like a little person sitting on top of it. So this would be the saddle part, and then this would be the bone that sits into the saddle, the carpal bone. And so this allows for biaxial movement. Is that biaxial? Biaxial movement is in that around, I guess it can move this way and it can move this way. Yeah, biaxial. Okay, last one is this ball and socket joint. So this is the head of the humerus sitting in the glenoid cavity or the glenoid fossa. We have two ball and socket joints in our body, and that includes the shoulders and the hips. And these are the most movable. So this is the multi-axial. It allows for flexion, extension. We could abduct, we could adduct, we can circumduct by taking our arms around in a circle. So we have lots of range of motion at the shoulder joint.